lastly, I'm also interested in what I see as really a huge legal revolution. There's been a huge extension of prohibitions and protections to species. There's also a huge conversation going on around different legal proposals for changing the laws that define what a crime is. And I'd really like to see people explore what those debates could mean for this trade, including ones that are really on the edges of seeming practical, like rights for nature. Does that hold anything for the illegal wildlife trade?
Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet and holding people in power to account. This podcast is recorded and edited on Gadigal land. Today, we're taking a look at the complicated world of the illegal wildlife trade and how experts and journalists can better cover the topic. In this conversation, our guests explore some difficult questions, such as how we talk about wildlife trafficking, what reporters can do to put a spotlight on it while protecting endangered wildlife, reporting fairly and accurately, while taking into account the nuances behind what drives the illegal wildlife trade. I'm joined in this discussion by Simone Haysome from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, Dwi N, Adhiasto, a 20-year-plus veteran in counter-wildlife crime trafficking, and reporter-author Bryan Christy, formerly with National Geographic. This conversation was originally recorded live for Mongabay's webinar video series, and it's a great examination on a complex yet high-profile topic of coverage. If you want to learn more, please see the links provided in the show notes. With that said, enjoy the conversation. But first I want to get started by introducing our panelists, starting with Simone Haysome. Simone is the thematic lead on environmental crime at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. She leads the work of the Market Monitoring and Friction Unit, which uses digital technology, including machine learning-enabled processes, to understand and respond to illegal online marketing of wildlife products. With a background working on drug trafficking and conflict-induced urban displacement, she has over a decade of experience conducting qualitative fieldwork in challenging environments and analyzing how urban development, corruption, and organized crime evolve and intersect. She is the author of The Last Words of Rowan Dupree's Murder and Conspiracy on the Cape Flats, published by Jonathan Ball. It is great to have you here, Simone. Thank you so much for joining us. You were muted there for a second. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just said it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
And also joining us is Dwi. Dwi has over 16 years of experience in combating wildlife trafficking, specializing in tiger, elephant, primates, pangolin, reptiles, birds, and manta rays. He is currently a research fellow at the Center for Transdisciplinary and Sustainability Sciences and was formerly a counter-wildlife trafficking specialist with the Wildlife Conservation Society. His expertise includes illegal wildlife trade crime prevention, crime scene investigation, community-based investigative techniques, data analysis, and many more. Dwi, thank you so much for being here.
Good night and good morning, Mike. Thank you for the introduction.
And lastly, but certainly not least, joining us is reporter and author Bryan Christy. Bryan is the author of the novel In the Company of Killers and the nonfiction book The Lizard King. He is the founder and former head of special investigations at National Geographic and a National Geographic Society Rolex Explorer of the Year. He introduced wildlife crime reporting to National Geographic and developed numerous important investigative and storytelling techniques that contributed to the arrest and prosecution of key wildlife traffickers, the passage of new laws around the world, and the closing of China's ivory market, saving tens of thousands of African elephants. He has testified before the U.S. Congress on terrorism in Africa and has provided trainings for investigative journalism programs, law enforcement, Interpol, CITES, and national government officials around the world, emphasizing his results-oriented reporting technique. Bryan, thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here.
And I am your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo, the Audience Engagement Associate for Mongabay. So let's go ahead and get started with our first question. So, what are the biggest stories today in the illegal wildlife trade for journalists to pay attention to? And anyone is free to go ahead and chime in.
I'll go. If I were doing a story today, two things would have my attention. One is oceans writ large. If we treated the species that are under the ocean the way we treat terrestrial animals, we would have a very different landscape, I think, for wildlife protection and a better planet. And the other is something that expands our concept of wildlife. And that's something that Al Gore announced this week with some others. And that's the climate trace technology, this new technology, satellite-based technology that is going to allow us to track exactly who the major greenhouse gas emitters are around the planet. And for me, as a crime story teller, the ability to pinpoint who's the bad guy for my stories is extraordinary. To me, it's the biggest story in the last 50 years in the wildlife space.
Great. Thanks so much, Bryan.
I had a couple of ideas, actually, probably too many. But one thing that occurred to me immediately after the conclusion of CITES is that species in the global exotic pet trade have just gotten a whole lot more protection. And I think that there's probably a lot to say, including about how that manifests on the online world and whether that extra protection from CITES will actually translate to a change in the trades, and also how they could be regulated differently if there isn't complete prohibition. I've seen over the last decade as well such fierce debates and also such terrible consequences around the securitization of conservation linked to the illegal wildlife trade. I think there's a big shift in that debate at the moment, and I'm really keen to see stories that explore what the alternatives are and what it means when communities and people living close to parks are not seen as part of the problem, but are seen as part of the solution. How does that work, and what are the outcomes? I think, lastly, I'm also interested in what I see as really a huge legal revolution. There's been a huge extension of prohibitions and protections to species. There's also a huge conversation going on around different legal proposals for changing the laws that define what a crime is. And I'd really like to see people explore what those debates could mean for this trade, including ones that are really on the edges of seeming practical, like rights for nature. Does that hold anything for the illegal wildlife trade?
Yeah, so I have some concern here about the current situation. So first is about the modus operandi of selling video online about violence against wildlife. So it's so many now. So for example, in Indonesia, more than 1,000 videos already uploaded to the buyers by online showing the violence against wildlife. And the second one is about the issue of stockpiling animal parts during pandemic. So animal parts product and also derivative, such as penguin scales. And also we talk about the difficulties to target high-level traffickers using anti-money laundering regulation is still a big challenge for now. Yeah, so mostly the arrest of address low-level traffickers where the evidence is in hand. And also a big issue about the implementation of crime prevention activities supported by green criminologies to increase policymaker understanding on improving prevention in the South Side through proactive actions rather than only focus on law enforcement or reactive approach. And another thing that actually also important is, for now, we need to start thinking about the plants trafficking rather than only focus on the wildlife trafficking.
Thanks so much, everybody. So there's great thoughts to share. This is a question for Bryan to start us off with, but anyone is welcome to add to it. So Bryan, you have suggested that weak reporting kills wildlife, and that journalists who cover the illegal wildlife trade should focus more time on paper and money trails rather than on treating the story as a jungle excursion with a sad ending. So can you elaborate more on what you mean by this and how the latter hurts wildlife protection?
Sure. I think that first it's worth underscoring the incredible responsibility that wildlife crime reporters have. The ecosystem that human criminals that we have in place to stop human criminals is fairly robust, but that does not exist in the wildlife crime space. So you don't have as many law enforcement, you don't have judges and prosecutors taking on wildlife crime cases. And it really falls to journalists and NGOs to inspire people to act and push for change. And so when you get a chance to tell a story as a journalist, and those stories are rare, the major platforms, media platforms, don't do a lot of wildlife crime reporting. And when you get that chance to tell a story, if you simply tell what many people do, a kind of Wikipedia version of the problem, here's the animal, here's me with the animal in the wild, here are some NGO experts, their comments, here's the law, here's CITES, a brief explanation of CITES, and then an end with, here are the statistics on the animal, and we hope things get better. That kind of reporting is basically a Wikipedia page, and it does nothing to inspire change. And so if you get an assignment and you do no more than that, you not only have squandered that opportunity, but you've also eliminated the chance for other people who want to report in that space. If the Times does a sea turtle trafficking story, the Guardian's not going to do that in any near time, nor the other major platforms, and Nat Geo is not going to do it if the Times has just done it. So it's really incumbent on journalists to take these on as crime stories. They're not nature stories, they're crime stories, and tell them like crime stories. And I'll have more to say on that. That's what I'm getting at.
Thanks so much. Anyone else? So, Bryan, did you want to go ahead and elaborate more on what you had to say about money and paper trails, unless anyone else has anything to add to the question?
So, to build on that, when I say these are called wildlife trafficking stories, and many reporters, when they get these assignments, think that they're telling wildlife stories or nature stories or science stories, and they frame them that way. And they don't realize that, from my perspective, what they've been handed is a crime story. And the beauty of a crime story, a traditional crime story, is you have a victim, you have a villain, you have a corrupt government official, you have a criminal investigator. You have basically all the elements of what you see on television that people watch day in and day out. And they're entertained by those, but they're also attracted to those stories. They want to read those stories. They don't feel powerless and sad the way most endangered species stories leave them feeling. And the beauty of a plot-based crime story is that you can pack it with a lot of information, all the science that we need to tell in a wildlife crime story, all the information about how an animal behaves, what is this animal? I mean, human crime reporters don't have to explain to the audience what a human is, but we have to, as wildlife crime reporters, we have to talk about the ecosystem. We have to talk about the laws that govern. All that has to be put in our stories, and it's a bigger burden. What the beauty of a plot-based crime story is, a plot-based crime story has a very strong back, like a pack horse. You can pack a lot of facts into a story with a strong narrative. So when I say you should be looking at paper trails, I'm saying these are organized crime stories, and I approach them the way I would a mafia story or a drug trafficking story, and then I write them the way I would a novel.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. Well, if we don't have anything else to add to it, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. And this one has to deal with something that we're all pretty aware of in this day and age, and that's social media. So what does the rise of social media and online marketplaces mean for wildlife trafficking? And how has law enforcement evolved to address this issue? And similarly, how have journalists had to evolve different ways to cover it?
Yeah, so if we talk about the online wildlife trafficking using social media and also e-commerce platform, so we understand that wildlife is a profitable commodities and also involving multi-taxa species. And if we talk about online trafficking, this is about the global coverage to attract buyers, and they also only display image and video to cover and also to hide their identity using an anonymous account. And no language barrier, so because they can use Google Translate to talk with other language, yeah. So it is real, yeah, and also mostly facilitated by cargo expedition, boosted by dropshipper, and we also detect third-party account to protect the layers of buyers and traders. And if we talk about the online, we also deal with the low volume of animals that were sold, but also huge in total. Online trafficking is easy to detect, but more effort to reveal. And also online trade actually operated by organized criminal groups. And this the way how to reveal the online trafficking is using digital forensic and tracking financial flow are key tools to open or to reveal that modus operandi.
Great. Thank you, Dwi.
I have a sort of one big ask when it comes to this question and journalists. I think that there is now quite broad awareness, at least amongst people that are looking at conservation, that there's a fair amount of endangered wildlife that is being sold online. People might know more than that, like that a lot of it is concentrated on social media. It's on the open web. It's in some parts of the world, Facebook private groups have become really the locus of the problem. Something that I would really like to see is for this story, and I think it echoes a lot what Bryan was talking about, is to be covered not only as a conservation or wildlife story, but as one that's very crucially about a political story about tech regulation. I know, Mike, you had asked about policing, and I think policing is key here. But I also think that there are huge challenges to what police will be able to achieve, monitoring and trying to crack down on these markets, given a lot of the grey areas that are thrown up by jurisdiction online and other issues. And that effective regulation will really only come when there's both effective action from the private sector and from law enforcement. And when it comes to the private sector, I think that a lot of the debate is affected by the fact that we think of platforms as being neutral. The word platform itself, it sounds like a shelf or a plinth or something that's just underlying the issue in a neutral and passive way. But actually, these markets wouldn't be possible without services that are provided by the private sector. They just wouldn't exist. And there are real questions that need to be asked about the decisions that are being taken inside companies, about how much money they spend on the problem, how many people they assign to the problem, the methods that they're using to deal with the problem, what priority it has, going beyond just asking whether they're part of the global coalition to end wildlife trafficking online, but really asking them hard questions about what they're doing about it.
Great. Thank you, Simone.
Yeah, that's good. I would add, following on that, it might not be a very clear point to make, but I was dealing with Facebook at one point, and they were working on their algorithms to try to stop or suss out who was trying to trade ivory. And they were skewing search results for certain terms. If you use certain white teeth or something, might be a term for ivory. And they were well-intentioned in that effort. But what I realized was it was skewing my ability to investigate how much of this was happening online. And the point I'm trying to make is that it can actually be much bigger than we investigators realize, because these companies are sometimes playing with their algorithms in ways that the traders are still getting around, but we who are researching how much activity is going on miss. And that was something that set me back, and I had to then try to engage with the actual in-house people at these places to get a better picture of what was actually happening. The one thing that as an investigator is really great about social media is you can, as Dwi was saying, you can sit at home and investigate these people, and just as they are acting anonymously, you have the ability to be pretty anonymous and follow what these people are doing. One thing that social media, in addition to making the transactions very easy to do, social media has also really compounded the feeling of community among collectors, so that they have are writing to each other. I belong to a bunch of groups of wildlife collectors and breeders of different species, and they're very open about what they're doing. Most of it is legal, of course, but you get this sense of this community reinforcement that leads to trafficking of the rare versions of this same species. And so the point there being that it's worth, as a reporter, investigating the community aspect of animals in trade.
Thanks very much, Bryan. Dwi, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so to me, using social media or e-commerce platform is tool to promote and to sell wildlife trafficking, especially during pandemic. So when the pandemic almost over, so this time for us, especially to work together with the e-commerce and also social media, because for example, like Facebook, they already have tools to screening the advertisement, but it's not enough. So based on our experience in Indonesia, only less than 10% of the advertisement and also account that can be closed by Facebook, and so many buyers or traders still can promote the animal parts using different words. So for example, like if we talk about, if I serve as a trader and then I will try to sell ivory, I can mention ivory in my advertisement, but I just use like cassava, or I use like other slang words just to avoid the detection from the social media screening or e-commerce screening. So this is the thing that actually very often but difficult to be handled by even artificial intelligence software. So I think this is a big challenge for now, to address online trafficking for Brandai.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So we're going to move on to the next question. This one is piggybacking off the earlier question that I posed to Bryan about money and paper trails. But is there anything that you all see journalists consistently getting wrong when covering wildlife trafficking? Is there any area that's really missing some nuance?
The biggest problem, I think, in terms of storytelling, and this is different from investigating the story or deciding which story to tell, which are separate questions. But in terms of telling the story, and this is the easiest to fix in a way, it is, again, this point that I made, is it's not realizing what kind of story you've been assigned to tell. If you are telling a wildlife trafficking story, it's not a wildlife story. It's not a nature story. It's not a science story. It's a crime story. And you should structure your story as a crime story. And along with that, your reliance on experts. This is where I think storytellers rely on the experts in the field, and they're all the usual suspects after a while, particularly in the elephant space, but it's the same for many species. There are 5 people around the world you go to tell that for their opinion on, or their expertise in this space. And it does not advance, it does not inspire people. Those telling a story by jumping from one expert to the next does not inspire people to take action in any way. And what we need are dramatic stories. An Elmore Leonard novel does not reference an NGO expert anywhere in the book. But a well-told Elmore Leonard story or a well-told crime story does have the power, dramatic power, to include all of the sorts of things we need to make a difference. We can include who the corrupt officials are. We can include what laws are not strong enough. We can include, if you have the space, and something that I evolved into as a wildlife crime writer, as I realized I was bringing people to my stories, and I could include in my wildlife crime stories about poverty and stories about disease and stories about terrorism. And a strong plot-based story is strong enough to carry all of that. And you can really make a difference with stories that remember that these are crime stories and not nature stories.
Thank you very much, Bryan.
Yeah, so if you talk about this question, so we have a long, list of publications that the journalists actually continue to publish the price of wildlife in the market. So actually the market is not affected by the price, but in the news, because the market actually controlled by the price. But if the journalists mentioning the price, it can affect to opportunistic traffickers to poach or collect the species because they want money. Yeah, but they don't know exactly about the market, but they just want money, so they can do poaching or other activities. And also, we identify that lack of research by journalists. They put wrong species name of confiscated species, or we understand that the authority very often to mention wrong name of species, and journalists just copy that. So this thing that actually very common happens. Yeah.
Thanks, Dwi.
I think something that does pick up again on this sense of go to the jungle and tell a story with a sad ending. But it seems to me that there is so much more reporting about what's happening in source countries, which is very understandable because that's where damage is happening. And that's when there's often these terrible scenes of nature being damaged and wildlife being poached. But what we know about wildlife trafficking supply chains is that there are other places far away from the scene of the crime that are hugely important. There are places where wildlife is consolidated, places where it's laundered, industrial centers near to or in consumer countries, which are hugely important for those products reaching market. And I see a lot less about those places. I worked on a report in the last few years on the trafficking of abalone, about which from South Africa, there's a huge legal trade, but then there's a very highly criminalized trade in wild abalone from South Africa. And there's been a huge amount of reporting in South Africa about the effects of that trade, which is all very valuable. But we know so little about what happens in Hong Kong, where almost all of that product is being laundered into eventually the Chinese market. But there's a fascinating story there about who controls the seafood markets and how certain key families wield huge power, how something like the abalone trade chain can be completely vertically integrated, which is something that we found, and why so few questions are asked, what enables that to be possible, about where vast amounts of seafood, not just abalone, are passing through.
Thank you very much, Simone. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question we have here, and it's a pretty big question. So take your time. But what do you think are the most promising solutions to the illegal wildlife trade? Are there any in particular that you wish that journalists were talking about or highlighting more?
This a little bit jumps ahead to a question I know you're going to ask us about, but I think that there's now a lot of attention on behavior change as tackling the root of what drives wildlife trafficking, which is people wanting to consume wildlife. I would, like to understand better how people's minds have changed in the past. I think there's so many places where people's view of how they consume wildlife have changed radically over the last few decades. And I think they're probably quite fascinating stories to be told about the interplay between economics and cultural ideas and the law about how that happens.
Yeah, I will say that when I was looking back at that question fascinates me too. And when I was trying to look back at the history of U.S. conservation, one of the moments in time was when the feather trade was very big in the United States, and commercial hunters were going down to Florida, to the Everglades, and killing thousands of birds at a time. And what some of the levers that were pulled to change that included a couple of rich women from New England who said enough is enough, and they got their society friends to start putting pressure to stop wearing feathers to glamorous balls and things. And but more exciting for me was the beginning of the Audubon Society, and it really began with children getting involved and bird watching, and that aspect of children getting involved when we did some of our big ivory projects. So one of the most exciting developments was there was a girl, Celia Ho, in Hong Kong who started an initiative. There were some children in California and New England in the United States who started initiatives and were able to bring a lot of people on because they have a very different agenda. And of course, we know children in the climate space have been very effective. So that's one area where I have hope for improvement. Certainly the technology, the ability to tell these stories on multiple platforms. This was something that I learned over time, that when writing a big investigation, you feel like, oh boy, I've really accomplished something and things are going to change, and they won't. You can't take a single bite at these problems. You have to, if you really want to be impactful and strategic about it, you have to think in multiple layers. You have to think, okay, here's my print story, the major feature, let's say if you're a writer. Here are the blog posts that are going to go along with that. Here are the journalists on the ground in the various consumer and demand consumer and supply countries that might benefit from pieces of this story that I uncovered. Let me reach out to them and give them pieces of this story and encourage them to tell the local version of this. I've written it in print. Can we get a documentary team together to do something on this? Can we get a podcast set up on this? If we're going to have an impact, it requires this multi-platform approach to change. And what's exciting is every day we become, as individuals, more and more enabled to harness a number of these platforms. And of course, Mongabay is a great example of an entity that's able to put these stories out and has great people on the ground in lots of these places, which gives a really authentic face to these stories.
Yeah, so I agree about Christy's statement. So, I mean that rather than journalists describing detailed sting operation strategy, the media, so the traffickers will easily change the modus operandi. So, I think that journalists can have more effort to publish news about the crime, not only about the crimes and law enforcement, but also promoting crime prevention activities, proactive actions, demand reductions, try to promote local heroes who save species or landscape, for example, or promoting more about the impact of wildlife trade that bring disease in the market, for example, or bushmeat market that actually will make and bring broader perspective to the audience and community, rather than focus on the law enforcement effort and also focus on the crimes that actually still become a big consumer for now.
Great. Thank you so much. So actually, this question sort of piggybacks on the answer you just provided there, Dwi. How does corruption aid wildlife traffickers, and how prevalent is it? Is there anything being done currently to fight it, and how can journalists more effectively cover the corruption and the solutions?
Yeah, so globally, actually, law enforcement rate to wildlife trafficking is stronger today compared to 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah. So, but now corruption already is still there, and now it's more invisible. So, high-level traffickers actually bribe corrupt officers to turn a blind eye, yeah, and not to help them directly. Yeah, different compared to 5 or 10 years ago, where the traffickers directly, like free protection or something like that. And the traffickers for now also try to bribe the justice system so that they will get a light sentence, and not to release them from the jail because it will potentially get suspicion from the journalists on also social media. So that's the main issue for now, yeah, about the corruption.
Thanks so much, Dwi.
I mean, corruption's an extraordinary, has always been a part of, for people to move wildlife, live wildlife and their parts consistently, because that's what should be most concerned about. It's not the one-offs, not the guy who said, oh, you know what, I found out this is worth something. I can put some of these tortoises in my suitcase, and he's just a one-off. To make a difference, you want to be thinking about who's doing this systematically. And illegal business is the same as legal business. You want predictability. You want reliable supply chains. And customs, historically, in most of the places that I've been, customs has been one of the more corrupt. And in places like the Philippines, people were terrified when I was looking at ivory of revealing who the customs officials involved in this were. And customs has always been on my radar, and I didn't do enough, haven't done enough in that space to look at customs as potentially a kind of syndicate where they are, even if they're customs for different countries, there's a potential that they're operating together on certain products. And that's something that's always intrigued me. But corruption is a very dangerous aspect of the illegal wildlife trade. And I always felt privileged as an American traveling abroad to tell these stories, because I could go home and it was relatively safe for me. And I was dealing with NGOs and journalists on the ground in these countries. It's a very difficult topic for them to take on because they're exposed when they do that. And so if you have a chance as a foreign journalist to expose some corruption, you're doing a service that often local journalists can't do. And one thing we found with geographic is if we reported on corruption, a lot of, in Malaysia, for example, the press was government controlled or influenced, and they couldn't report on corruption, but they could report on what National Geographic was reporting. So if we talked about corruption, they would report on that, and it would put a corrupt official or wildlife department in the news. And it was very effective.
I would say on corruption, I mean, I completely agree with what both Dwi and Bryan have said. It's very difficult to report on for all of the reasons mentioned, but it's absolutely crucial. It's the reason why any of these trades can happen at varying degrees. That could be quite petty corruption, or we've seen in various wildlife trades, which were high value, extremely serious corruption at high levels of the state. I think one of the things that at the organization where I work, the Global Initiative, does across different crime types is always try to understand what are the systematic drivers of corruption. Very often, corruption is a lot more organized than people give it credit for. People think of it as one-on-one personal interactions between low-level functionaries and crooks, but they're often organizations are captured by systems where they have to pay upwards in the chain to their superiors or people who got them the job, or where a part of the state that is a gatekeeper for an environmental resource has become corrupted over a period of years because of the pressure put on it by criminal profits. And I think it's very hard, but one of the most useful things to do is to try to get people to speak to you about what their incentives are for being corrupt, what pressures they face. That mean that that's how things work.
Great. Thank you all for answering that one. We're going to switch now the topic to something that I think a lot of people are probably going to be interested to hear about, which is technology, and how journalists can meaningfully cover it. So the question is, how can journalists meaningfully cover emerging conservation technology that tracks and traces wildlife trafficking? What are some of these technologies? Are they available all around the world and in the locations where they're most needed?
I'll start. There are, I mean, the technologies available, emerging to help monitor wildlife, to try to trace the trades, to try to stop poaching, to evaluate, for example, whether to collar an elephant and be able to see when that elephant has stopped in a way that suggests it didn't stop for natural reasons. The satellite technologies are evolving all the time. It's a really exciting area, and it's impossible to keep up with, but it is fairly easy to search and find who the major innovators in the technology space are. Nat Geo has its Explorer program, and there are you can go on their website and identify a bunch of the people who are working in technology areas. The one aspect that it took me a while to see was that surveillance technology, which is often what we're talking about, is a two-edged sword. And some of these companies have figured out that the technologies that they want to use to surveil people, communities won't stand for. And so they pitch their surveillance technologies as ways to protect wildlife. And they get into these markets, greenwashing their way in. And they are putting technologies in the field in Africa, for example, that we would never stand for in the United States. They're facial recognition technology and other things that monitor communities and people on the ground that we would never stand for. And sometimes they cover that by saying these drones and these other things are for watching these animals. But when we give approval to these sorts of things, or as journalists, when we don't interrogate whether there is a nefarious side to these things, and are we treating this story the same way that takes place in South America or Africa, the same way we would treat it were it to be told in the United States? And too often we don't.
Yeah, so if we talk about the technology, actually many technology can be applied for helping the authority, for example, to combat wildlife trafficking in the world. Yeah. So, for example, like if we talk about digital forensic and then wildlife forensic, including DNA forensic, face recognition to identify the poacher captured by camera trap in the forest, for example, using crime scene investigation to reveal the cases, or using criminal network analysis software to map the criminal network connections. Or for now, we can use ADNA, environmental DNA, to identify the species without more effort to get the species directly. Yeah? Or we can use bioacoustic to detect bomb phishing in the marine area, using dog detection or electronic nose for now. So actually many technologies can be applied for combating wildlife trafficking. And I think a law enforcement officer in the world actually can access that technology, but the problem is they don't know exactly, most of them, they don't know exactly how to get that access to the technology. So making publication about the new technology actually will help the countries to get access for the technology itself.
Thanks, Dwi.
I think one of the technological areas that I'm watching at the moment that I find very interesting is around DNA technology, because it has so much potential to be useful at identifying where things come from, ultimately, as well as other technologies. A colleague sent me an article about an X-ray technology that would be able to help identify whether animals had been captured, bred, or had come from the wild. So there's sort of technologies that could be used both at a customs frontline or reservations around the problems of customs, not just being about technology aside, but make problems of identification far easier, and could also be used in understanding what routes were being used and in prosecution. I think one thing I've come to understand is that technology itself is quite proven and not really at the forefront of DNA technology anyway. The really hard nut to crack is one about international cooperation. And I think that aspect of your question, do these technologies reach all the places they need to, is a really interesting one, because there are not that many incentives for people to develop global databases, global biobanks, to share DNA samples from seizures which come from animals from a different part of the world. I think there's a kind of political layer to how technologies will work for transnational trades. That's interesting. And secondly, I think kind of the inverse of this question of whether technologies can be used malevolently against communities, which I think is an important one, is I think there's really interesting stuff to be explored about when and how communities can access emancipatory data systems and technologies, how they could use them to keep other people accountable. There are already some examples of that in Latin America, with imagery and deforestation being used by indigenous groups. I think those are, an example of a very interesting line of questioning.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next question here, which is something we're all very well familiar with, but it's incredibly important to discern how has the pandemic influenced wildlife trafficking before and after borders reopened, and how has this affected wildlife markets and wet markets?
Yeah, so if we talk about the pandemic situation, so I have a good example on how like market countries like Vietnam or China, when they try to tighten ban import of wild meat. So in the source countries, the local market then created to adopt border protection increasement. And while waiting the situation getting better for the smuggler side, so they start to, to do stockpiling and then start to sell stockpile when situation is actually considered safe for them to sell protected animals. And we also identified that rather than putting a high risk to smuggling wildlife in the high volume through international exit points, the smuggler actually, they now smuggling wildlife in low volume but very frequent using land borders or remote ports. So we have a case study about orangutan smuggling from Sumatra, northern part of Sumatra, in Aceh to Malaysia, and then goes through Thailand borders and Myanmar, and then finally goes to India in Mizoram, and then before heading to other countries. So this is the same route for smuggling drugs also. So they try to avoid the national exit point because the protection in the international exit point actually better compared to before pandemic. This is not because authority in the international exit point try to avoid smuggling, but also try to reduce the spread of the disease. And this gives impact to the smugglers to smuggling animal using international airport or seaport. And also using online to cover whether buyers actually very common during the pandemic, and also actually wildlife market and bushmeat affected by pandemic, but after situation better, then the market already busy with the bushmeat and also the market, for example.
Thank you, Dwi.
I use legal markets as a surrogate for evaluating illegal trade. And I can say that in the reptile space, the pandemic among traders that I talk to, and some are pretty large, they've had their best years ever. And people are home, people are adopting dogs and cats, but people are also collecting pets. And this goes back to social media. They're on social media more. They're reinforced in the notion that they should expand their collections. And if that's happening for legal animals, it is certainly going to happen for illegal animals. So, and I know that the TPP funds, the funds that the federal government has given to help out during the pandemic, people have talked about how they use those funds to buy more snakes or other collectibles.
Thank you, Bryan.
I have nothing much more to add other than this is something that's also come up across our research is in many parts of the world, people saying that they saw a rise in online trade and acquisition of exotic pets during the pandemic. I think in some places we did see the opposite effect. So movement restrictions really impacting, we suspect, being the reason behind falling rhino poaching rates in Southern Africa and pangolin poaching rates in Palawan, which I think says very interesting things about how important those international connections are via movements of people to make these trades possible.
Thank you so much. We've got a few more questions that we're going to try and, there's actually a couple of audience questions that already are congruent with some of the questions that we're going to go ahead and address right now. But first I want to talk about talking about locations. So here at Mongabay, we work to keep the geographical details of our reporting about rare or newly discovered species vague to ensure that we don't enable illegal wildlife trafficking. Have you all noticed that journalists sometimes can unwittingly enable illegal wildlife trade? And what do you recommend reporters do to avoid this happening?
I tried, and it was hard at Geographic to impose a rule that you can't put location information for an endangered species, a newly discovered species. The same for price. And there's a really fun story about what happens when you expose an animal. This isn't a discovered species, but this is an old story, but it's one of the cornerstones of wildlife trafficking. In 1981, Nat Geo did a major story on wildlife trafficking. And their reporter went all around the world and talked about species, chatouche, the Tibetan antelope, and various species, snow leopard pelts, and rare birds and things. And he went to Thailand and took a photograph of a guy named Mr. Dang, who had a white python around his neck. And the caption under that photo said, Mr. Dang of Bangkok hopes to get $20,000 for his rare python from his major buyers in Germany, Japan, and the United States. Smugglers, traffickers read National Geographic to identify species to smuggle. A couple of Americans read that article, saw the price that Dang was offering, knew what they could get for the snake, flew over to Thailand and stole that snake from Dang. And they brought it back to the United States and started breeding it instead of just trying to sell it as a one-off. And they started breeding these albino pythons, created a industry of white animals that then evolved into other genetic morphs. And it's a multi-million-dollar, maybe even billion-dollar industry today. The aisles you see in PetSmart and Petco, big chain pet stores devoted to reptiles, are because of that single snake and the money it brought into the reptile industry. The snake that Britney Spears wore around her neck was the descendant of that same snake. It was all because they didn't think through at Geographic what it would mean to put the location and price and in this case, the buyers too, of an individual animal in the magazine.
Yeah, so to me, so revealing the location of animals, in province level actually is quite safe, or revealing species location in protected areas, because the government actually also promote that same things, species in the protected areas. So I bring a specific issue about the mentioning location of human-wildlife conflicts, because usually the detailed location written by journalists until village level. So this makes easier for the poachers to get to the location and then doing poaching like swampland tigers or elephants in the conflict locations. And since many years, actually, traffickers, they are so clever. They learn from the paper or journals or having field guide book that sell by a bookstore openly. So they can identify the location of the detail. This is really true. And that's problem-based situation for now.
It's tough. I mean, I've sat down with people who are not, only went to high school and are not readers, and they sit down with very technical journal articles that talk about a newly discovered species and look at the latitude and longitude of, because that'll be in those articles by way of identifying, and they get on a plane and go get it.
Simone, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, nothing personally beyond that. I know that this is a major issue, and it's also become standard practice in academic journals, as people have said. I know it's a huge issue in the orchid trade, and that an orchid will only grow in the shaded side of a small valley, and collectors can wipe it out within a week of it being announced.
Thank you all for elaborating on that. We just have like a minute left before we're supposed to engage in the audience questions, but we actually already had 2 more questions that are planned that audience members have already asked. So I'm going to go ahead and breach those right now. One of them is what are some examples of effective tactics or campaigns that people have used to specifically to try and reduce the demand for wildlife?
Yeah, I put the issue about this question. So, I mean that if you talk about species that are legal for trade, so having a good campaign on animal welfare or improving animal care can extend the lifespan of the animals being kept by the owner. So it will reduce the potential to buy the animals again, for example, like that. Or other example is like the traders in the market, they can get a socialization about how to prevent the infectious disease in animals, and also improve their treatment to reduce the death of the animal. That's also, they don't need to buy or purchase another animal. This is the thing that actually, we are not trying to deal with them illegally, but try to improve their understanding about the disease, improve understanding about how to maintain or how to nurse the animals, and also how to keep the animals to make sure that they can keep the animals as long as they can without any effort to buy animals again. That's the thing that actually become important to do.
Yeah, there's a kind of perverse way of reducing pressure on wild populations. Australia famously lets no animals out, and as a result, so that basically gives anyone who's willing to smuggle out of Australia has a monopoly or an oligopoly on the laws they're willing to break. Some of those species, some Australian species, breed incredibly well. The bearded dragon is a small lizard. It's maybe the most popular lizard now in the American pet trade. They breed readily. The founding stock, much of it was smuggled out of Australia. Now it's bred. It's hard to stop. If you have a pair of bearded dragons, it's hard to stop them from breeding. But because they're all over the pet trade, you can go in any pet store in the United States and find a bearded dragon. People would be crazy to try to smuggle a wild animal out of Australia. So it's a perverse example of how a absolute prohibition actually can hurt wild populations, and allowing captive breeding can take pressure off the wild, which is what all smugglers say. But there are examples where it does work.
I'm quite interested in a story that was just told to me in briefly by a colleague who works on a parrot-focused NGO. about the huge decline. The US closed its markets to wild caught birds in the 1990s, I think it was, and the EU followed suit in the early 2000s. And those were the two largest bird markets in the world. And that is often portrayed as being a story about the effectiveness of closing markets and prohibition. But what had been told to me is that the part of that story that's less well known is how much NGOs and animal rights groups, the campaigns that they had also done in those same markets around the same time to try and shift people to less harmful forms of consumption. So away from species that they could say rightly were terrible as pets, very hard to look after properly, could be linked to disease. I don't know exactly what their messaging was, but I think that story is probably one, again, where there's an interplay between the law, economy, the fact that captive breeding was possible for within those countries and affordable for the consumers, and then also this messaging. The other example that I think is quite interesting is in South Africa, the NGO Panthera has worked with the Shembe religious group to create a really realistic and hardy and high quality leopard skin, fake leopard skin, to be used in ceremonial dances. And that has become extremely popular and extremely satisfying to those consumers as a substitute for real leopard skin. I know there's also ongoing work in West Africa around the use of vulture parts in traditional medicine and working with traditional healers associations to find herbal substitutes for those parts. So I feel like there is both ongoing, recently concluded, and more historical examples, quite a lot of them out there, if one knows where to look.
I'll follow on Simone's really good point that one aspect of the wildlife trade that's not touched on enough is the cruelty involved in legal businesses, whether that's farming of animals, but I'm thinking of the exotic skin trade, python skins and monitor lizard skins that are used for handbags and belts and things. We have not done enough reporting on the cruelty behind those industries, the way those snakes are captured. And I've spent time in the slaughterhouses. The way they are killed is incredibly painful for those animals and primitive. And a few of the major houses have stopped their use of, major fashion houses have stopped their use of exotic skins, but LVMH, which is maybe the biggest luxury goods producer in the world, has not. And I think to the extent we can influence through storytelling people's consumption, one thing is that people are afraid of snakes and they don't mind in the abstract anything that happens to them. But if more reporting talked about the cruelty, the clubbing seals sorts of stories, we need to have more of those about how the world really works, how we get these animal products.
Great. Thank you, Bryan. I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to move on to our audience questions here. And I'm going to pick ones that I think I'm going to try and answer as many of them as I can, but we'll go ahead and we will have a hard stop in about 15 minutes from now. But I wanted to go ahead and address this question that came in. It's a really good one from a gentleman named Scott. And Scott asks, can the panelists comment on the role of whistleblowers and protecting and incentivizing them?
Yeah, so I think it happens in many times. So I give example in Indonesia. So some cases of pangolin scales trafficking, actually, the whistleblowers, actually, they inform the information to the authorities. But the whistleblower, they ask the guarantee for them to protect themselves and also his family from the criminal networks. So that's why the authority, especially the police, they give a protection to the family and also him, and also give another benefit and also work for him to live from his job inside the criminal network, how to say, environment. So this is the thing that how the authority try to get information from the whistleblowers, from traffickers inside the networks, and try to, how to say, attract them by giving benefit and legal activities that can be used by him and the families.
I would say that would be a great area to explore as a journalist, is are there funds available to whistleblowers? And I'm not an expert in this space, but there are efforts to pool funds to encourage people to anonymously report. In terms of encrypted communications, I'm thinking of some of the Pandora papers, and some of the bigger investigative efforts have given protection to whistleblowers. But in terms of funding them, compensating them, that would be that happens in different criminal spaces, and that would be a great thing. That would be a great article. What's happening in this space? It would potentially inspire a donor organization to set something up, and that could be great.
Thanks, Bryan. The next question here, I can't seem to locate the actual comment that was placed up there, but I'll go ahead and I'll use the one that I had in here. And it has to do with sometimes the fact that media coverage can focus only on high-profile seizures of charismatic species, while less known species threatened by trade can sometimes slip under the radar. So what are some species that are commonly trafficked that don't receive more attention from the press?
Yeah, I think there's still many. So, for example, like Bryan and also Simone described about the reptiles, about lizards, snakes, freshwater turtles, tortoise, also under the radars. And also marine species like giant clam as substitute of the ivory, and corals, also high numbers in the wildlife trafficking issue. And also marine shells. This really under the radar of the journalists.
The sad thing is every species you can name virtually, and every part of that species has a market somewhere. And the stories of those species need to be told. For me, this is a big topic for me. What stories do we choose to tell? I did a major reptile investigation years ago that had a big impact in Malaysia, but it didn't have a big impact for a while outside of Malaysia. And I along the way, I learned that NGOs, one of the biggest NGOs, does market research to determine which species engender the most contributions from people. So, and what they found were tigers, polar bears, elephants were among the species that brought in the most donor money. And I thought that if that's true, then that is probably also true. That would inspire the most people to act to try to conserve those species. And if those species are umbrella species in a natural ecosystem, it is probably the case that they are an umbrella species in terms of civil society and legal protection. In other words, if I can get people inspired to want to protect elephants, the laws that they pass and the actions they take might trickle down to many species. And so I chose to focus for years on some of the bigger charismatic megafauna because they're charismatic and people care about them. But there are other matrices to use to decide which species to go after. And it's not enough to say this is being trafficked. This krill is being trafficked. Krill has no inherent appeal to people. You have to figure out how to tell a story about krill. And I'm using krill as an example because I so want to write a krill story. It's killing me. And I've been that way for years. Same for bluefin tuna, which are basically the elephants of the sea, the rhino of the sea. And we're not getting good stories on them. And they're not charismatic megafauna, but there are other ways to tell that story. You can tell that story by how critical they are to an ecosystem, how extraordinary the volumes being consumed by them are, the behavior of an animal that is extraordinary. These are hooks for bringing in an audience to species that are lesser known and they were never a stuffed animal on a child's bed, which is the charismatic megafauna.
I would also add, I feel like this issue is partly inescapable, a bit like Bryan is saying, like some species just are so much more appealing to the general public. And one of my first thoughts on seeing that certain turtles had gotten protection in CITES was just literally, oh, that's so great. The really ugly tortoise that looks like Voldemort in the Harry Potter movies has been listed. I would echo what Bryan's saying, but just add that another way to make these stories interesting is also about what's driving the people involved to be involved, or a lot of less charismatic species to the general public are highly traded precisely because they're very weird looking and collectors want them for those reasons. And yeah, sometimes what's compelling about the story is everything around the species rather than the species at the heart of it.
I completely agree with that. And that reminds me of Tom Wolfe was one of the great American journalists, and he did years ago, it was called New Journalism. And he wrote this really scathing analysis of how bad journalism was in the United States. And he said, journalists need to use the tools of fiction writers, and we need to use signifiers of class in our nonfiction as an example of something. And that's absolutely right, that it's not always the animal that is the story. It can be the incredibly wealthy people who are exploiting that animal. What toad toxins is something that was in the news recently, of these people who are going out to the West and I don't know if I forget whether they're injected or how they swallow this toxins from toads, but that was all told in a kind of look at what these wealthy people are doing without this was a New Yorker piece I'm thinking of, reference that I saw to the exploitation of the species or the inhumanity involved in exploiting a species that way. But yeah, absolutely. The wealthy consumer in these markets offers a really cool opportunity for a storyteller to talk about species that aren't inherently appealing.
Great. Thank you very much, Bryan. I have a question here that I think is probably really important to address. And it's asking, do you have any tips or insights for journalists that are pitching or getting started with their first couple of wildlife crime stories?
Take a story that you would write even if they didn't give you the assignment, even if they weren't going to pay you. You have to care, to me, you have to care about it that much, that you can pay your bills, but go after that story. And if you're that hungry for it, it's going to come across.
I don't have a ton to add, just other than the story that Bryan was talking about is actually written by a friend of mine, a journalist called Simone de Creef. And Simone is a person who wrote a lot about the abalone trade. And I worked with him on the report that I talked about earlier. And I think that when I think about his career, it embodies a lot of what Bryan has just said, a lot of early reporting about an extremely uncharismatic sea snail, but which really allowed him to develop such enormous expertise about everything else that was going on, and with an eye for the social and the political and the economic around that trade, which but I think was his entry point into now a very varied career, writing about all sorts of crimes and all sorts of animals.
I should add that he's a great writer, and I really respect the work that he does. Yep, absolutely.
I also have a question here. I think we've already answered it, but I just wanted to make sure that she got a chance here to say hi. This is from Erica, and she's saying, nice to see you again, Bryan. And my question is anyone here also considering the illegal e-commerce of wildlife? So if there was anything else you had to add to about that subject, feel free to go ahead and share any closing thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think what Dwi and Simone were saying about online trade is accurate, and it's helped expand. It certainly hasn't contracted the trade in any way, and it has absolutely expanded it. But it has also, this is the thing, it's also expanded the opportunities for investigative journalists. And it's wonderful to be able to sit at my desk and reach into the trading worlds of game breeders in South Africa who are trading over marketplaces, to go into the price discussions on message boards and that sort of thing. We also have opportunities as journalists.
Great. Thanks so much, Bryan. Anyway, folks, we are just about out of time. And so I just wanted to give a big thank you to our panelists here for providing such an informative discussion. And as always, to our audience here who continues to participate in these webinars, which we hope are continuing to inform the work that you do. So thank you for joining this final webinar of the year. And hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Again, if you want to learn more about Mongabay's webinars, please head to YouTube and search Mongabay TV, find our live broadcast or our YouTube playlist, Mongabay Webinars. You can also subscribe to our webinar newsletter. Links to all are provided here in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay newscast or any of our podcast content like our sister series, Mongabay Explorers, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is indeed the best way to help expand our reach. But as always, you can support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a nonprofit news outlet. Even just $1 per month does make a difference and helps us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And also, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media. Find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or as I mentioned earlier, on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.